Welcome! In this series of short videos, we will look at topics for the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today, we will look at adding tooltips to the controls on your dialogs. Today, we're going to be looking at putting tooltips on controls in your PowerBasic Windows application. When you're designing a Windows application, it's important to make the application as easy to use as possible. Much has been said about making applications intuitive. However, intuition is a very subjective term. An application can only be intuitive if it's similar to an application the user has used before. Since we're using Windows as our development environment, all of the objects you'll be putting onto a screen will be common regardless of what application you're developing in. There will be text boxes, buttons, drop-down lists, and many other types of controls. Obviously, if we're putting text boxes on screen into which the user is expected to actually enter information, it's important to have some kind of label beside a text box to tell the user what the text box is actually for. However, if you have a dialog that is quite crowded and has many controls on it, there may be limited room for labels. This is where tooltips come into their own. A tooltip can be attached to any of the objects on your dialog, so that when the mouse hovers over the dialog, the tooltip will automatically appear. So, how do we achieve this? Let's have a look at the code. In order to establish our tooltips, we're going to add a new library today, a tooltips library. Now that we've added a library, we want to actually initialize our tooltips. I'll go into the code inside the tooltips library in a moment, but first I'd like to show you how we can easily add tooltips to each of the controls on our dialog. If we go to the event handler, the callback function for the dialog itself, we'll find in the initialization section, which is run before the dialog is actually shown to the user, this is where we want to put our calls for creating tooltips. If we wish to put a tooltip on, for example, the progress bar, all we have to do is to call one function in our new library, and this function has the sole task of putting the tooltip onto the control. So the function is called tooltip setTooltip, and we're passing it a number of parameters. The first parameter, which is effectively the Windows handle of the dialog itself, we are obtaining by running a getDialogItem function, giving it two parameters, the dialog handle and the handle of the object, and the getDialogItem will return the Windows handle for the object. And the second parameter is a piece of text we want added as a tooltip to that particular control. So if we run our code now, we'll see the dialog appears quite normally. However, when we move the mouse over the progress bar, a tooltip will magically come up. And after a few seconds, the tooltip will automatically disappear again. So in order to add a tooltip to each of these controls, we merely need to call this function for each of the controls on which you want to put a tooltip. Now, to save us a wee bit of typing, we can use the prefix command to help put this in. And having put the prefix command in, the prefix command will take the first line in quotes, and it will add that to the beginning of each subsequent line within the prefix block, and it will compile it as such. So if we wish to add a tooltip to the exit button, we merely have to put the handle for the object and the text we want to put on the form. So if we run this now, we'll see that our exit button now has a tooltip. So if we add each of the other ones onto the list now, we'll see we can put a tooltip on the combo box, the text box, the OK button, which is labelled next, and the list box. I've also attempted to put a tooltip on the label control. Now, if we run the code now, you'll see that the text box now has the tooltip, the combo box has the tooltip when you hover over the drop down, the list box has one too, and both of the buttons have their tooltips. However, if we hover over the label, you'll see that no tooltip appears. This is because a label has nothing the user can actually do to input text to it or select anything. Therefore, while there will be no syntactical code error for putting a tooltip on it, it will just never display. Now, one additional thing that the function will allow us to do is if you think a tooltip is actually quite long and you wish it to appear on 2 lines, you can quite easily do this by adding a delimiter. I've created a pipe delimiter between the words how and far. If we run this now, you will see on the tooltip, after the word how, it folds down to the following line, and we now have a tooltip on 2 lines. So how did we create this new function? Well, let's load the tooltip library and have a look. Here's our tooltips library. Now we're using some constants at the beginning, and we're loading in a few of the Windows libraries if they haven't been loaded already. There are some constants we're using at the beginning. We're initializing our common control library, and the first function we actually call is the tooltip set tooltip. So if we have a look at that function, we'll see in here it's calling a subfunction to create the tooltip, and if that returns a success, a value other than 0, then we come down to this piece of code here. So let's look at the tooltip create first. What the tooltip create's actually doing is making a call to a create window X function. Now this is a function that allows you to create a window on the screen. Now we haven't actually covered the create window X command at all so far in our tutorials, mainly because we've been concentrating on the dynamic dialog tools. But this is a lower level function, part of the Windows API to create a window on the screen. And in this case, we're doing it specifically for the Tooltips class. And we're additionally setting the maximum width of our tooltip to 300. So if that does actually manage to create that, it will bring us down to here. And here is the replacing the pipe character with a carriage return in the text we're passing. Its first job is to remove any existing tooltip that's connected to this control. And having removed it, it then attempts to put it back in again. One of the additional options I'm using here is a disable XP theme command. And this is calling a function I have down at the bottom here to turn off the XP themes for this particular control. This allows us to actually use the foreground and background colors. If we didn't call this disable XP theme function and we ran the program, you would see the tooltips would still appear, but there would be no colour in them. The foreground colour would be black and the background colour would be white. It's very much down to personal preference. I think that the background colour of yellow makes the tooltip more visible. You of course can change the colours for the foreground and the background as you prefer. So what we've seen today is adding tooltips to your dialogues to supply the user with additional information on what a particular control is for or what will happen when you select it is remarkably easy to do. There is more we can do with tooltips, but that's it for today. Thank you for watching.